Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. We were hoping for more participants today, and we did have more signed up. I know we've been having some technical difficulties this morning, so we may have more people joining us as we go, but thank you for both of you for being here today. So this webinar is on the neuroscience of gambling addiction from science to practice, and Michael, who is our presenter, is logged in as Nico's Chinese Health Coalition, and I am logged in as Michael, so I apologize for any confusion. But my name is Mai, and hold on, sorry about this.
Sorry, I will return to that screen.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay. All right, so we are presenting this webinar through funding from the Problem Gambling Prevention Technical Assistance and Training Project. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that, but it's funded through the Office of Problem Gambling and the California Department of Public Health, and we're just one of many partners around the state working on gambling prevention education. And Michael and I are both from Nico's Chinese Health Coalition. We are located in San Francisco, Chinatown, Washington, and Mason, and our mission is to enhance the health and well-being of San Francisco's Chinese community, and we've been working in the community since the 80s, and we're a public-private partnership of many different organizations, I think close to 40 now. And there's a lovely picture of our office, should you ever have a chance to visit. So just a couple things about the webinar. You may have already noticed that you are muted. So this just means that throughout the webinar, we won't be able to hear you if you speak into your microphone or your phone. But during the question and answer period, then we can unmute your line if you wish. Just text me in the chat box. So we will be using that chat box as our main mode of communication, as you may have already seen. So we'll take questions at regular intervals, and you can either ask the whole group or you can message me. Again, I'm Michael, privately, and then I'll make sure that your question gets answered. Also, there's a raise hand function that you can use. You might see that right next to the up at the top where there's the dial-in code, there's also a little hand symbol. You can use that to raise your hand, but I have a funny problem where my hand gets raised all the time without me pressing it. So the easiest way, again, is to just use the chat box if you have a question, and we'll make sure to look at the chat box when we pause, and we'll get to your question. All right. So there's some background noise, Michael. I'm not sure if that's the feedback from your end or mine.
Oh. Sorry, give me 1 second. I muted the wrong person. I muted you because I thought you were me.
That's okay. Oh, hi. Welcome, Jenny. We just have another person join us. All right, so some very important things that I want to go over. Hi, Jenny. Hopefully you can hear me. So after the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete an evaluation. So this evaluation is really helpful for us to get feedback on the webinar, and this will also be emailed to you too. So if you don't want to complete it at the, right at the end, that's okay. But the post-test will not be emailed to you afterwards, and you must complete this for CEU, so do not skip past the post-test. You have to take it right on the spot after the webinar is over. And there's no way for us to email it to you later, so there's no exception to this. So please make sure to complete your post-test. And then you will get your CEU certificate in 3 to 5 business days. And if you don't get one, then you can email Michael, and his email is on the screen. All right, well, with that, I will turn it over to Michael, and he can introduce himself. And again, please use the chat box if you have any questions or technical difficulties, and we'll try to address those as best we can.
Great, thanks, Mai. Okay, So, good morning, everyone. If you have difficulties hearing me or have other issues, please go ahead and use the chat box option. My colleague, Mai, who is logged in as Michael, can assist if you have any tech issues during the webinar. And so why don't we go ahead and get started? Hopefully other people who might be experiencing technical difficulties will be able to join throughout the webinar. Real quick about myself, my name is Michael. I think I know everyone on the webinar for now. I'm the Director of Programs at NICO's Chinese Health Coalition. I've been working at NICO's and primarily working on the problem gambling project since about 2005, 2006. And as a family member of a problem gambler, I actually, after started doing the work in problem gambling, I learned that my own stepfather was a problem gambler. So it always makes me feel a personal connection when we make presentations and hearing stories about people who have been affected by problem gambling, either because they themselves are the gambler or because of their loved ones. So in the past several years, we've been making presentations to San Francisco's high schools, colleges, universities, and to a lot of social service organizations. And one of the most popular topics that we typically present is the neuroscience piece. There's a lot of interest, and we've been attempting to present this information in an easily digestible way that that can be easily understood by consumers, by educators and clinicians. And so we hope that this information that we'll present today will be also useful, not only for your own knowledge and learning, but also possibly something that you can use to educate clients or to be able to help assist them in their journey of recovery. So the purpose of the webinar is to give you some current knowledge about just some of the neurological basis of gambling addiction. So how does that happen? What is happening in the brain that's causing addiction? So some of the agenda items for today includes, we'll begin with some basic brain facts and some of the key developmental phases of the brain development and how that relates to addiction. We'll give you a basic 101 of neurons, how actually on a neurological and cellular level, how they work and how that again relates to addiction. We'll talk about the chemical messengers in our brain, neurotransmitters, and some of the ones that have been implicated in addictions. And we'll talk about then how is the neurological process hijacked by addiction. And for the latter part of the presentation, I hope to focus on more related to recovery and treatment. So first, I'd like to talk about the subtypes of problem gamblers that have been identified in research, how this may be able to help us narrow in on an intervention that may be more specific and effective with particular problem gamblers. As we know, not all problem gamblers are the same. And we'll talk about some of the implications of the research we have today on neuroscience for recovery and some of the things that we can do as clinicians and providers and some of the things that clients can do themselves to aid themselves in recovery. And we'll end with next steps and resources. Okay. So let's start with some brain facts. And again, just like in our other webinars, I try to keep webinar participants engaged. So we'll be doing, we'll have opportunities where you can participate in polls, answer questions, and also to encourage you to use the chat box to either share your thoughts and or to ask questions. So let's begin with some brain facts. And then these will actually be some poll questions. So the first question is, at birth, approximately what % of the neurons that we will ever have are already present in our brains? So why don't I go ahead and pull up the poll. Let's see. 1 second. Okay, so this is something that you should see popped up in your screen now. Okay, we have about half of the participants voted. I'll go ahead and okay, we had one more that just came in. Go ahead and close it and share the results. I know not everyone may be able to be next to their computers and do their votes. So go ahead and close. It seems like it's a pretty split result at this time. So I'll go ahead and hide and share the actual answer. So interestingly, we've learned from some of the research that actually almost all of the neurons that human beings will ever have are already present in our brains. So why isn't it that, little toddlers and babies are already geniuses, right? Even though the brain cells may be present, the neurons, and again, neurons are brain cells that communicate with one another to transmit information and signals. As human beings grow through life experience and other environmental exposures, they continue to build connections between neurons, and that's what enables us to learn and become and gain skills and so forth. And as we'll learn later also that although almost all the neurons may be present, we continue to see some regenerations in some areas of the brain, that there is some plasticity in our brain, that it's not all just static. The other question is, at age 2, our brain is approximately what % already of the adult size? So we'll go ahead and do this as a poll as well. So by age 2, our brains are already at what percentage size relative to adults? Great. So I'll go ahead and close and share. And so a lot of us have indicated about 60 or 80%. So the answer is actually, several of you were correct. It's about 80%. In fact, by age 3, our brains are already approximately at 90% of adult size. So our brains grow really rapidly in the first couple of years, in our first several years of life. However, again, as we continue to grow and mature, the brain grows in density and in the number of connections, and is what ultimately determines how fast signals are being transmitted and where learning takes place. So great job. Given that our brains grow so rapidly in the early years, one other question I wanted to ask, and again, this is why we see little babies have proportionally large heads, right? So given that our brains grow so quickly and rapidly, approximately at what age is our brain considered fully matured? And so let's do one final poll in this section before we move on. So approximately what age is our brain considered more fully matured? Is it at 18, 21, 25, or 99? Okay. Great. Go ahead and close and share. So we used to think that by about age 18, our brains are fully developed. We consider, at least in our country, that age 18 is legal age, adult age, and we allow alcohol consumption and a lot of gambling activities at either 18 or 21. But research actually shows that our brain, although it goes through a rapid development during adolescence, that the maturation continues way into our 20s. research is now showing approximately or about age 25, but the range for individuals could differ from the mid or late 20s for different individuals. Research also shows that girls typically, their brains mature maybe a little bit sooner than boys also, so there's a gender difference as well. So interestingly, based on this, when we present and educate high school students, we often ask them, well, what are some of the policies that might be developed or based on this science? And in fact, if we think about what are some of the legal ages we allow individuals to, for example, purchase tobacco products, to buy lottery tickets, to drink, to gamble, those ages typically are much younger than when we know by science that the brain is more fully mature and to be able to make more optimal, healthy choices. There's only one activity that typically, or one policy that is typically based on this science and is related to cars. I don't know if anyone want to venture and guess on their chat box. What is this policy related to cars that typically a lot of companies will not let you do until you're age 25? Any guesses? Rent cars. So Christine mentioned about car rental, right? So a lot of companies may even flat out not let those who are under 25 rent cars, or if they do, they might charge a really high premium. This is actually an ad from Allstate, I believe from a while back. It asks, why do 16-year-olds drive like they're missing a part of the brain? And there's obviously you can see a car-shaped part of the brain that's missing, and the ad continues to say, because they are. And so while this ad is an exaggeration, one of the policies that's based, insurance companies and rental companies learned early on that it is not economically feasible or smart so that those who are younger than 25 rent their cars, because younger drivers tend to take more risks. Not that younger drivers can't be great drivers. They may have fast reflex. However, because their brains are not fully matured, because the brain is still developing, oftentimes we see higher levels of risk-taking among young people. When it comes to driving, it could be things like driving while texting nowadays, driving without seatbelts, speeding. And so we'll talk more about this risk-taking and brain development. But again, a lot of the research, a lot of the policies related to risky behaviors like smoking and drinking typically are not based on or not aligned with brain research. So this is the sequence of brain development. The brain develops from the back to the front. So a lot of the things that are important for initial survival, motor skills, obviously a lot of the areas that we need to survive, regulating temperature, breathing, all those things are developed very, very early on, even before our birth. And as we're born, some of these areas develop first. Or as we are developing in utero, some of these areas develop first, like cerebellum, which is important for physical activity, motor skills. Nucleus accumbens may come later, related to motivation. This is the drive. We'll talk more later, but this is the area that's important to drive us to seek out things that often are pleasurable, that are important for survival. Amygdala may come later. Emotions, emotional memory, associative memory. The last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. Again, this is the part of the brain that's not fully developed until about approximately age 25. This is the part of the brain that's important for judgment, making decisions. A lot of times when we go to the high schools, we ask the young people, is this a good thing or a bad thing that judgment is last to develop in human brains? And we often get very mixed answers. And it's actually, in fact, true. It's not one or the other. In one way, it is a bad thing that judgment develops so late, because we oftentimes then can see harmful behaviors like drunk driving, and risk-taking. We've probably all seen those crazy YouTube videos of young people taking risks. I used to live in a neighborhood where oftentimes you'll hear people doing donuts in cars, and chances are good, if you probably check who those drivers are, they're probably not 40, 50, 60, 80, 90-year-olds. They're probably younger people. And so judgment, while because it develops last, could lead to sometimes problematic or even harmful behaviors. However, it's also a good thing because while risk-taking can be harmful, it's not always a bad thing, right? We want young people to take risks, to be able to try different things. That's how we learn. That's how we pick up new skills. If you can imagine a young person, a toddler or a little kid who already has a fully developed prefrontal cortex, would they be as adventurous to try out new things like learning to ride a bike? They might say, well, that thing has 2 wheels. I'm not getting on that thing and risking falling and skinning my knee and hurting myself. So those are skills that they may not learn, right? And so it can be a double-edged sword. Okay. So real quick, we'll go ahead and talk in general terms about 2 systems in our brain. We definitely know that the brain is a lot more complex, but it may be easier when we work with clients to help them understand, to couch or frame the discussion about neuroscience in more general terms. So let's talk about 2 parts of the brain. One can be considered the go system, the gas system. We can also see this part overall as the limbic system, but it's made up of several different components and parts of the brain. So the go system, this is not the higher functioning, not the logical thinking brain, but more of the reflexive, more of the instinctive brain. It's an older part of the brain, sometimes called the reptilian brain, because it's a more ancient part of the brain, evolutionarily speaking. So some of the parts that compose the limbic system or the go system include the VTA. The VTA is an important part of the brain that is one of the main sources of dopamine. Dopamine, we'll talk more later, is kind of the pleasure chemical. It's released in many different parts of the human brain, but VTA is a crucial area that we need to keep in mind when we think about addictions. We also have the nucleus accumbens, again, motivation and drives. When a person's brain becomes hijacked by addiction, this is often the part of the brain that's responsible for producing the overwhelming cravings and urges. This is the part that drives individuals to want to seek out that behavior some more because it has mistakenly associated that behavior with its survival. The amygdala is also an important aspect. This is often seen as the fear center of the brain, the emotional center of the brain. It's also important for developing emotional memories. This is oftentimes the part of the brain that's important when individuals have triggers. Individuals experience a cue, like walking by that liquor store where they used to buy their lottery tickets. Even though they've been abstinent from gambling for years, even decades, a flood of emotional memory can possibly come rushing back and creating an overwhelming urge and craving. So the trigger oftentimes is embedded within our amygdala, our emotional center. So again, we'll go through some of these in a little bit more detail later. The limbic system, again, is an older part of the brain. It's important for survival. A lot of the things that we need to survive that we don't have to think a lot about often is regulated by some part of the limbic system, including breathing, heart beating, food digestion, all those things, blood pumping. All those things are needed for survival, and they aren't things that we need to voluntarily control. The limbic system does that for us. A lot of the things, incidentally, that are important for survival, like eating, like drinking, are also linked to our pleasure centers. This is why our limbic system has such a large overlap with pleasure centers. We are wired that way. Human beings are wired so that a lot of the things uh, we need to survive also feels good, so that it motivates human beings to continue to seek out those behaviors so that we can survive. However, in addition to physical needs, right, like eating, if you eat that juicy hamburger when you're really hungry, it feels good. Can you imagine if eating doesn't feel good? If eating feels like a chore, which it could be for some people, would you seek out food as much if eating doesn't feel good? No. Would you seek out different types of foods as much? You may not. Then you may not get as many different kinds of nutrients and different kinds of energies that your body might need. So in addition to physical needs, however, we also have emotional needs. Human beings may need to feel loved, may need to feel cared for, may need to feel safe. And so human beings also have an arsenal of coping mechanisms when we don't have our emotional needs met, right? When we talk to some of the high school students, a lot of them tell us, well, this is how we cope when we feel stressed. Sleeping it off, eating foods that they like, listening to music, through friendships, or through talking to friends or sports. This is how they relieve their stress and how they cope with their emotional needs. However, we also have individuals who might use the Homer Simpson approach, right? Through substances, through the use of drugs or alcohol, or even gambling. So a lot of times we tell the high school students, a lot of times how we choose to cope, especially when we're young, has an important effect on our brain. It could have long-lasting changes to our brain. So this is an example we often give. Let's say a young person goes through something traumatic when they are little. When they're 5 or 6, let's say they, or let's say when they're 10 years old, they go through something traumatic. They lose one parent. The older brother sees that the younger sister is going through a lot of emotional pain. So he shares some of his beer or alcohol with her, thinking it'll make her feel better. Normally, alcohol may taste really bad to this young girl, but because she's emotionally vulnerable, it actually tasted good. For a while, she was able to feel numb, to not think about her pains and forget her problems. So let's fast forward to a few years. She becomes a college student. And so she goes through another traumatic experience. She breaks up with the first love of her life. What do you think is the first urge or craving that comes to her? Most likely alcohol, right? Drinking. The brain actually remembers. It's become embedded in the survival center. The brain says, do you remember the last time you felt like this? Do you remember how we survived? We drank. Alcohol helped us to survive. So now I'm going to make you crave alcohol so that you'll go out, purchase alcohol, drink, so that we could survive this experience too. The brain has now believed that alcohol is important for survival and is trying to to help us survive. So all of that is intricately connected. And this is how a seed of addiction can be planted. Of course, we also know that although we have urges and cravings in our brain, that we don't give in to all of those urges and cravings at each given time. It's because we also have a stop system. So our brain's brakes, or the stop center, is the prefrontal cortex. It's important for making judgments, long-term planning, goal planning. It's also important for controlling impulses. We may give in once in a while and treat ourselves to something that we really like. However, most of the times we weigh the pros and the cons, and we may delay gratification. Instead of playing video games now, because we know that we need to finish our homework, we should do our homework first and delay the reward of playing video games until later, right? We do this on a daily basis. Oops. So interestingly, we learned that our brain's limbic center, our go system, and the stop system, the prefrontal cortex, isn't completely connected. That at around age 9 and 10, our prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe actually goes through a dramatic wave of growth. And this growth is represented by millions and millions of new synapses, connections that are built in our prefrontal cortex region. And so you can see in the adolescent's brain, we're starting to build a lot of new connections. However, we also see that later in life, we see a pruning process that takes place, where connections that are frequently used are maintained and even strengthened, and connections that are rarely or not used at all are actually pruned away, just like you would prune a tree, take out some of the leaves that are browning, or in order for the other branches or leaves to become stronger and have more nutrients. So why don't we do also another quick poll at this time. The question is, around what age does that major synaptic pruning begin? So in adolescence and in young adulthood, at approximately what age does that process begin? And we're going to launch that poll real quick. Okay. So is it from 9 to 10, 11 to 12, 16 through 18, or 20 to 25? Give you another moment. Okay. So it seems like the majority of us feel like somewhere between 16 to 18. So I'll go ahead and review. Research is telling us actually that the process is fairly long, but it begins approximately at age 11, where a massive pruning happens. However, this continues throughout and actually isn't complete until in our 20s, approximately the time when our brain maturation is coming to its peak. So, why does this pruning process happen? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? We might think that, hey, the more connections, the better, right? Why don't we just leave all these synapses, all these connections between the neurons there so that we can use them? We could think of it kind of like a highway with so many connections, so many junctions, so many exits. The more there is, it may be easier for things to get lost, right? To know at the last moment which exit I'm supposed to take. More connections may not necessarily mean better. In fact, once an adult brain is more fully settled, we actually strengthen the connections that we use more, and strengthen it so that the information becomes more efficient and more speedy. So in fact, this is actually a good process. We also see that during that process, we have this thing called myelination, where the brain cells are being coated or insulated so that it becomes more efficient at doing its job. Just like when you insulate a copper wire, this process actually makes signals travel faster, and the efficiency and speed of signals is really crucial in, obviously in human beings, in how fast our reflexes are, in how fast we're able to process information and learn new things. And so through this process, we also kind of see this hardwiring of connections that we use more. This is why we tell young people that this is a really crucial time. How you choose to expose, or what you choose to expose your brain to, really has long-lasting effects. If you play a lot of music, write a lot of music, those parts of the brain that are important for processing music and auditory signals will be strengthened. If you play a lot of video games, if you play a lot of computer games, the parts of the brain that are important for that get strengthened. If you engage in gambling, risk-taking, a lot of those parts of the brain then will get strengthened as well. And we're realizing that the hardwiring process may stay with individuals not for months, not for years, maybe even decades. And so again, this is why we see that young people, again, may have higher risk if they start early. We'll talk about that in a little bit more. Again, just real quick also for the developmental process, because the connections between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex is not more fully developed yet in young people, that we often see young people rely more on the older parts of the brain to process information. Okay, so as you'll see, there are some photos of people's faces on the upper left. Real quick, maybe in your chat. Oh, never mind. I realized the correct answer is already on there. When we ask young people what these faces are actually portraying, and these actors are actually portraying the emotion of fear, young people are a lot more likely compared to adults to mistakenly label these faces as surprise, as shock, as anger, rather than fear. And the researchers also noticed that when young people look at these faces, their amygdala is activated. Again, this is the emotional fear center, is the reflexive gut reaction center, whereas adults more rely on the prefrontal cortex or the logical thinking. This is why we see that young people, again, use more of the gut reflexes, may more likely misinterpret cues, and may also be more likely to rely on emotional or fear centers to process information. Okay. So like we say earlier, because the connections are not fully made, young people are a lot more likely, or that the younger people start to use drugs and alcohol, they're actually more likely to become addicted. We see from research with alcohol use that the younger individuals start drinking. As you can see from this chart, those individuals who started drinking younger than age 13, and incidentally is around the time when that pruning process and the hardwiring process begins, they're significantly more likely to develop problems related to alcohol, alcohol addiction, alcohol abuse, compared to people who only started drinking at or older than the legal age limit, which is 21. Interestingly, we see that in gambling is exactly the same. Problem gamblings are a lot more likely than their non-problem gambling peers to start gambling before 8th grade, right? Which is also, again, around the time when that pruning process has started. My own stepfather, who who had been a meth addict and also a problem gambler later on in life, actually started gambling before age 11. Started really, really young. Of course, we know that not everybody who is a problem gambler starts when they're really, really young. We also see later onsets of gambling with people, especially when we see female problem gamblers often start at a later age. And so we know that it's not always that the people who start young develop more problems. Part of it is also family history. So those who have maybe a biological or genetic predisposition for addiction because they have a family history of addictions are significantly more likely to develop problems. So you can see the red line are those who actually have family history for alcoholism versus the black line, which is those who don't. And there's a great difference among them. Of course, you can see that for everyone who starts young, their risk is heightened, but there's also a difference made by family history. Similarly, with problem gambling, individuals who have a family member who is a problem gambler are a lot more likely to become problem gamblers themselves. So again, there's a combination of both genetic or heritability factors we find in studies of identical and fraternal twins that problem gambling has an element of heritability of more than 50%, and that genetic studies have found a particular dopamine receptor gene variant is more common among pathological gamblers compared to people who are just recreational gamblers or just gamble a lot, excessive gamblers. And so definitely there is a biological component, right? However, we can see that genetics doesn't explain everything. And so there's definitely an element related to environment as well. For example, in Oregon, when they compared the experience of close to 100 problem gamblers, and they wanted to see what are some of the common causal pathways to problem gambling. What are some of the common reasons that people become addicted to gambling? The number one pathway identified was having had some kind of traumatic experience, whether it be experience related to physical or sexual abuse, or experience related to individuals who have served in wars. We see a lot of high rates of addiction among returning war veterans. So traumatic experience, we also know from research, can actually physically alter the brain. So life experience later on can definitely also make changes to the brain that could increase someone's chance of developing addiction. Okay. So let's, for the next couple of minutes, do a quick overview of neurons so that we have a common understanding, and we'll go into more specific about how all this process works on the neurological level. Again, neurons are brain cells that communicate with one another. Let me do a quick pause. Let's see if there are any questions so far. It's a good suggestion from my colleague Mike. Why don't we do a quick pause? If anyone have any questions or comments or additional thoughts, you can go ahead and post them in the chat box. Okay. And again, throughout the presentation, feel free to continue to use the chat box if there are questions that come up. Okay, I'll continue then. So neurons are brain cells that communicate with one another. They use both an electrical form of transmission as well as a chemical, and both are required in order for the process to work effectively. So some of the chemical messengers that we'll talk about will include neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. But there are many, many others that are involved in sending signals and inhibiting or activating certain responses in our brain at all times. And a lot of drugs of abuse will activate many of these different kinds of neurotransmitters. In terms of gambling, we'll just focus on some of those today. So real quick, just a basic overview of how neural transmission occurs. We have the cell body with a nucleus, and the cell body, the ends of the cell body is responsible for intaking signals and information, and that gets transmitted through the axon, through the body of the cell towards the end of the cell. And so this information is electrical in nature, and it gets sent to the ends of the neurons. The ends of the neurons then in that in the red circle are responsible for continuing that signal. But however, you can see in the blue sphere, there is a gap between the neurons called the synapse. The gap works almost like an electrical short when we talk about an electrical circuit. So we need something to bridge that gap or bridge that short. So that's where neurotransmitters come in. So once the electrical signal travels to the end of the neuron, neurotransmitter is used to continue that signal in a chemical matter through that gap, through the synapse, thereby linking the action potential of one neuron with the synaptic potential of another. This is a more close-up of what that process looks like. So we're going to talk about some of these neural transmitter processes in a little bit. But real quick, this is also a question that we ask our audience a lot. Is it true or false? Drugs and alcohol do not make a person high. True or false? And I just realized I don't have a poll for this one, so I'll just go ahead and show the answer. Okay, so a lot of times when we talk to the high school students, it can be very surprising to them when I tell them that, well, technically it's true that drugs and alcohol actually don't make a person high. Drugs and alcohol actually activate chemicals that either activate existing chemicals that are already in our brain or mimic chemicals that are already in our brain to make us feel the way we do. In order for a chemical that we put into our bodies to have an effect on our brains have to already have a receptor that can receive that particular chemical in its chemical composition and form. So, for example, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, those chemicals actually have we have a receptor that corresponds to that chemical in our brain that will actually activate the neurotransmitters that are already existing or produced by our brain. We can smoke anything we want. We ask the high school students, if you go home and smoke your house plant, would you get high? And chances are good, not only would it not make them feel a sense of pleasure or euphoria, that they would get a really bad case of smoke inhalation. It's because not everything in life that we can ingest or smoke or inject would would release the neurochemicals that are already produced by our brains to make us feel excited, to make us feel soothed, to make us feel calm. This is why people can become addicted to non-chemical things, right? Like gambling, like sex, like shopping, like internet. All those things will anything almost that are pleasurable will release neurotransmitters in our brain to make us feel the way that we do. And this is why people could become addicted to things that they're not putting in their body, and that the brain is also changing, even though we're not exposing our brains to a chemical, because the chemical changes are still happening within our brains just through what we already produce ourselves. So let's talk about some of the main systems that have been implicated in addictions. Okay. The serotonin system, obviously, is something that has been talked about a lot. We may all be very familiar with serotonin. We know that we've seen those commercials for antidepressants. Many of them work on the serotonin system. We have learned that serotonin actually has a very broad effect on the human body. And among the many roles that serotonin plays could be could be implicated in regulation of the mood, appetite, our sleep, even memory. We know that just by doing activities like meditation, yoga, breathing exercises, through any form that relaxes us, our brains naturally produces serotonin. For many people, we don't need to take a pill for our brains to release serotonin. Just by willpower, just by different behaviors we can do, we can release serotonin. Of course, there are those who have chronically low levels of serotonin, and those individuals oftentimes may experience issues like depression, irritability, problems with sleeping. We also know that individuals who suffer from obsessive compulsive disorder also experience chronically low levels of serotonin. And a lot of the drugs, like the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, the SSRIs, will work to increase the level of serotonin in our systems. A lot of the drugs that could increase serotonin include cocaine, amphetamines, LSD, and of course also medications like SSRIs like Prozac and Zoloft. It's quite interesting how the role that serotonin plays, because we realize that serotonin is also important for impulse regulation. So interestingly, they were able to replicate a gambling task in mice, in rats. So, if we can think it, we can do it. We've apparently taught some rats how to gamble. And we've also enabled some of them to become addicted to gambling in a way. So this is actually a study that's modeled after the Iowa gambling tasks, where it's a task that was essentially designed to test how human beings are able to weigh risks versus rewards, and how in different situations do human beings emphasize reward over risks, or if people are risk averted, whether they might do that as well. So in fact, they were able to design a model for rats. So these rats are in a controlled environment. They can go to 4 different holes in order to get a reward, sugar pellet. And so these 4 conditions have different risks and rewards. The first option has the lowest amount of reward, only 1 sugar pellet each time that they arrive, but it also has the lowest punishment, the lowest risk. It only has a 10% risk for a short 5-second timeout, meaning for that 5 seconds there will be no sugar pellets when the rat comes back to that hole. The second option has 2 pellets and a 20% chance of a 10-second timeout. And as you continue to go up, you see that the reward goes higher, but also does the risk. The third one has a 1 in 2 chance of getting a very long 30-second timeout, but it has 3 pellets each time when the rat comes to that area. The last one has the highest risk, highest punishment, but also the largest reward. So, which one do you think most people or rats would go to? What is the most optimal one, you think? What would you choose? Any thoughts? So probably the most optimal would be maybe option 2. So in the long run, actually can produce more net gain. And so in fact, they find that rats are super smart. Given time and trial and experience, they actually learn to gravitate towards option 2, because they learn that in the long run, they get more out of that and less punishment. So interestingly, they started to give these rats different kinds of medications to alter their neurotransmitter systems. When they found that a particular drug that decreased their serotonin levels actually made the rats become more problematic gamblers. When the rats had lower levels of serotonin, they gravitated towards some of the more high-risk, high reward and high punishment options, like option 3 or 4. And so interestingly, it seems that serotonin definitely plays a role in maybe desensitizing some of the risks and increasing some of the impulses to get more. This sounds definitely like a lot of the addicts that we've encountered, right? It's all about instant gratification. It's about more. If I could get more now, why wait for later, right? It's all about I want it and I want it now. Another neurotransmitter that's important to consider when we talk about gambling is norepinephrine. Epinephrine is another word for adrenaline. Again, this is important for keeping focus, paying attention. We know that adrenaline is important for that, arousal. And individuals who have chronically low levels of noradrenaline or norepinephrine, which is the brain's version of adrenaline, suffers from conditions like ADHD, maybe even depression and other issues. So we find that problem gamblers have been found to have lower levels of blood or plasma levels of noradrenaline, and that this possibly could indicate these individuals may chronically feel understimulated, could feel bored, and could be considered high sensation seekers. They need more excitement, more stimulus in order to release adrenaline, to release brain adrenaline in order to feel more normal, right? And so gambling could be a way of self-medication. Finally, let's talk about dopamine. And this one probably will focus most of our time on because it's probably one of the neurotransmitters that's been most implicated in addiction. Dopamine is important, oftentimes seen as a pleasure chemical, is important for it's oftentimes a reward chemical, makes us feel good. Anything that feels good oftentimes will release dopamine. We also see that oftentimes lack of dopamine can produce a lot of problems, including feeling lethargic, low energy, depression. We also know that those who suffer from Parkinson's disease have chronically low levels of dopamine that could lead to problems with voluntary movements, and we also see that patients who actually have Parkinson's, who are on medication to increase the level of dopamine, have been found to spontaneously develop problems with gambling, even when they've not had inclinations toward gambling before. So let's move through this a little quicker. We realize that dopamine is not just important for pleasure, that's also important for learning and anticipation. We realize that dopamine doesn't necessarily get released in our brain only when we get rewards. So let's talk about that a little bit. We've had this very landmark study, the Schultz monkey experiment, where they looked at monkeys who are given a reward, fruit juice. And they see every time before the monkeys get fruit juice, they have a cue, a light that's flashed. And so after several pairings, when do you think the dopamine is released? At the cue, the light, or the actual reward, the juice? So we know from conditioning, right, that after several trials, the monkey's brains actually starts to produce or release dopamine at the cue. They're starting to learn. Dopamine is important for learning. It helps us to learn what are the cues we need to pay attention to in order to get the rewards that we need to survive, right? So they say, oh, okay, every time I see the light, I know what's coming next. So I need to remember this pattern. So after a while, they start to separate the monkeys to have two different groups. One group, they show them the light, but no reward. No fruit juice after a while. So what do you think happened? The response becomes extinguished, right? We know that after a while, the monkey's brain says, hey, you know what? Now there's a new pattern. Every time I see the light, there's no reward. So I'm going to now de-associate that relationship. I'm going to learn a new pattern. So now every time, not only did the dopamine release gets reduced After a while, it stopped firing altogether when they see the light. It's called extinction, right? The other group of monkeys, they actually didn't show them the light, and they gave them fruit juice. So what do you guys think happened to the dopamine levels? A lot of the students that we present to say, oh, it probably just restarted. However, interestingly, we find that not only did the dopamine increase, it actually almost tripled. So why are surprises so rewarding for us, right? It's actually all, again, about learning. It's a new pattern. The monkey says, oh, wow, that was a completely new situation. So I'm going to reward the brain so that the brain will try to remember this so that we could try to predict it in the future. It's all about how do we anticipate rewards? How do we know and learn those patterns so that we could know how to get it again in the future, right? Does that sound just like gambling, especially, let's say, slot machines? Slot machines work on an intermittent variable schedule of reinforcement, right? Where we don't know when it's going to pay out. We may have past small wins that continue to drive us, but we're always going for that big win. We never know when that's going to happen. And this is why gambling, and particularly some types of gambling like slot machines that work on this schedule, can be so reinforcing and potentially so addictive, right? We know that jackpots in slot machines is oftentimes, let's say, 777, right? There's so many slot machines out there now with so many different kinds of icons, so they could be so different. But in this particular slot machine, let's talk about 777 as the jackpot. Obviously, that's the most exciting, most rewarding. So let's look at this one. Let's say we have double bar, 7 cherries. What's the outcome? No win, right? There's nothing that you win. What about this one? 7, 7, double bar. So in both of those situations, there are no jackpots, no monetary wins. However, which one do you think is more exciting or more stimulating to the brain? So we're going to go ahead and do this one as a poll as well. Which following outcome is more exciting? Double bar, 7 cherries, or 7, 7 double bar? Okay, so let me go ahead and close the poll. If there's any other last minute entries, this is the time. Okay, great. So all of us understand that the second option is more exciting, but from a neurological perspective, that almost doesn't make sense. Why is the second option more exciting when, in fact, the outcome for both is the same, right? So we know from research that, in fact, it is true that these, what we call near misses. Near misses are situations where, you know, we are one icon away from winning the jackpot. It's a lot more exciting. Our brain actually gets tricked. On a neurological level, on the left, you see a brain that actually won a jackpot. This is an actual win. You won money, which logically makes sense that our brain releases a lot of dopamine in our reward center. We get excited. We're like, yeah, we won. However, we also see that the brain on the right is actually someone who experienced a near miss. Someone who was one icon away from winning. The brain actually reacts almost like a win. It produces not quite as much dopamine, but also a lot, because the brain says, oh my God, I was so close. I was almost there. That means if I just work harder, if I put more money into this machine, I will get that jackpot soon. It's just a matter of time, right? But in fact, that's not how slot machines work. There are no skills in slot machines. You can't practice to be a better slot player. You can't pull the lever harder. You can't hit it at the right exact time. There's nothing that you could do to control it, right? And so, however, the brain actually gets tricked to think that, wow, I was almost there. I have good skills. I just need to practice more. And actually, machine manufacturers exactly know this. They know it very well, so they actually program slot machines to produce near misses at a higher frequency as compared to some of the other possibilities. And so, in fact, they know that this phenomenon makes them more money. So, okay, it's important to know that gambling is exciting for everyone. They make it so stimulating. Doesn't have to be a problem gambler to get a response in our brain. It's natural. All human beings find the unknown and that the possibility of winning money exciting. But we also know that certain people respond differently to the stimuli. We know that dopamine is important because people who naturally have lower dopamine receptors actually are more likely to find drugs or gambling more exciting. The top picture is a brain of someone who has high levels of dopamine receptors. More receptors are more red. The higher, the more red the color, the higher concentration there is of dopamine receptors. That means these individuals are more easily stimulated by the daily rewards. Things that you and I may find exciting is exciting for them as well. The bottom picture, however, is someone who chronically has a low dopamine receptor level. These individuals have less red in their brain, in their reward centers. And so for these individuals, they might need more excitement to get the same level of response in their brain. These individuals, when they were given methylphenidate, which goes by the brand name Ritalin, right? That's prescribed for ADHD. This is a stimulant, similar to the effects of amphetamines. So when these individuals are given a stimulant, the people who have low dopamine receptors find it more pleasant, more pleasurable. These individuals probably normally crave more stimulation in order for their brains to feel normal. And so definitely people can be predisposed. Okay. Let me move on to see if there's any questions real quick. Again, I don't think there are any questions that have been posed so far. I can move on to talk about what's happening in the brain when we become addicted. Okay, because I know that actually we only have about 50 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get to the treatment and recovery piece as well. All right, real quick, another poll. What's the method of drug delivery that will reward the brain the fastest out of all of these four? Is it smoking something, injecting something through a syringe, snorting something, or ingesting, eating, swallowing? So let me go ahead and launch the poll. Great. So it seems like a lot of us feel like it's injecting. In fact, the answer is smoking. So smoking substance actually hits the brain the fastest because the substance goes into the lungs really quickly and is absorbed into the lung blood, and in effect quickly then travels to the brain shortly after that. Injection is the second fastest method, and followed by snorting, and then ingestion is actually a slower form of reward to the brain. Why is this important? It's because we know that how quickly a substance or a behavior rewards the brain and how quickly a person can start that cycle again can make that behavior or substance more addictive, more destructive. So for example, the same substance, cocaine, used in smoking form, smoking crack cocaine versus injecting cocaine into the bloodstream, or snorting cocaine. Crack cocaine actually rewards the brain much faster. And so in effect, we can also see more people develop problems related to that method of drug use. So how does this relate to gambling? We also know that certain types of gambling may reward the brain faster. For example, slot machine oftentimes is called the crack cocaine of gambling because the time that you put in the money and the time that outcome is determined is really, really quick. And so the faster you can reward the brain, the faster it can become addicting. This is why we see that slot machines oftentimes can be a source of problem where people actually develop problems much faster. They spiral downwards and hit rock bottom much faster if their primary game is slot machines. So this is something to think about as well for working with clients. How the brain copes. Drug use, gambling even when you win a lot of money, for example. A lot of dopamine that's more than normal rushes the brain. And so actually the brain compensates by reducing the number of dopamine receptors at the synapse. So as a result, the user will crash or come down. They'll feel not normal. They'll feel like, I really need to gamble again or to use those drugs to feel normal. So you can see on the right is the brain of a meth user. All the red part of the brain that's gone is because the brain is trying to compensate. It says, oh my God, we're getting flooded and inundated by all these dopamine, all the chemicals, so we need to reduce the number of receptors. So the red part is gone. There's less density of receptors, and the brain doesn't feel normal. This is part of the withdrawal experience, right? Dopamine is actually really important in playing a role in withdrawal. A lot of times we see that the low levels of dopamine receptors actually persists for months. And so people are chronically feeling understimulated and their brains don't feel normal when that happens. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to hide the poll. So you couldn't see any of that. Okay, so now you should be able to see the slide. Okay. Let's talk a little bit more about tolerance. So because the brain, again, dopamine repeatedly stimulate dopamine receptors, the brain has to compensate. They do that both by decreasing the number of receptors so that not as many dopamine is picked up and activated. And the remaining receptors also become less sensitive to dopamine, so not as big of a response is activated each time. And so interestingly, we know from research is that it doesn't have to happen over and over and over. You don't need to keep gambling over and over or keep using a drug to create tolerance in our brain. That even just in single exposure alone is enough for the brain to actually start to develop tolerance, meaning to start to compensate. In fact, we also found in research that in drug use, that tolerance can occur within minutes. Okay. This is actually what we see in the brain of gamblers. On the left are brains of individuals who are healthy controls, who don't have comorbid problem gambling disorder, or co-occurring major depression and other issues. On the right are brains of people who meet DSM-4 diagnostic criteria for pathological gambling. So comparatively, which group, they all participated in the same activity. They were engaged in a guessing game where they could win money. Which group on average experience more activation or more stimulation? As you can see, more stimulation is more colors. And so typically the controls had more stimulation. So why do you think that might be? It's probably easy to see that, problem gamblers probably would need more stimulation to release dopamine, to feel excited. For the controls, this is new, this is novel. Maybe for them, this is more exciting. But problem gamblers need more. The research also showed that the more DSM-4 criteria they met, the less activity there was in their brains, meaning they developed tolerance. They need more now. the same amount of bets doesn't do it for them anymore. My stepfather over time needed to bet more and more money in order to get the same excitement and thrill. So this is the neurological evidence of tolerance. Not only that do we build tolerance, our brain is getting used to it. Our brains also hardwire the parts of the brain that are sensitive to reward seeking, to cravings and urges. This is actually evidence that in meth addicts, over time, the parts of the brain cells, the neurons in the nucleus accumbens, again, this is the part of the brain that's important for driving us to seek out things, is the part that's important for developing cravings and urges, actually increases in number, size, and strength. So not only do we develop new brain cells, we know in neuroplasticity that brain growth or neuron growth is possible even after in our 20s. And we also see that the neurons are strengthened by the myelination process, that it's going through a hardwire process, that they get strengthened and thickened. And so we see that this process actually, again, the changes may last for years, even decades. We see this is why people who are addicted, who have been abstinent for 10 years, 20 years, could walk by that liquor store where they used to get their lottery tickets or drive by the casino on the freeway and actually get triggered because the changes are still hardwired in our brains, and that oftentimes can take a long time to undo. And for some people, that struggle can become lifelong. Long-lasting brain changes, again, triggers can become present for a long time. Even after being drug-free or even gambling-free for 100 days, the brain activity, you can see on the right, can still be much lower than normal. Some of these brain changes can last a long time. We also see that, again, people who have been in recovery, social drinkers versus alcohol drinkers, when they see alcohol-related visual cues like a glass of ice-cold beer, that the brain responds differently. A lot of dopamine is released in anticipation, and it's creating those cravings and urges for them to get more. Similarly with gambling. We see on the top is actually someone who is waiting to win money in a simulated game of gambling, like roulette. The part of the brain that's activated is the nucleus accumbens. So we see that the urge and craving center is very activated by these visual cues. Not only does the gambler's brain have a go system that needs a lot more stimulation, they also have a brake system that is understimulated. We see that in brains of problem gamblers, not only do they not have an activation, right? The part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is actually blue. As you can see in this particular area, blue actually not only means no activity, it's actually a decreased blood flow. So meaning that there's actually a decreased activity in that region. So for example, problem gamblers, when they are asked to do a cognitive task, like the Stroop task, as you can see, the Stroop task, have words written in colors. When you ask individuals to say the colors that the words are written in and not read the words, for example, in this particular task, the clients would read red, blue, green, red, yellow, blue, green, red, red, yellow, blue, red, rather than reading the words. And so that actually requires the brain's prefrontal cortex to kick in order to apply the brakes, because visually our brains are wired so that our instinct is to read the words. However, the prefrontal cortex needs to kick in and hit the brakes and say, wait a minute, I'm supposed to say the colors. People who have injuries to their prefrontal cortex or addicts actually almost can't complete this task at all. And that other addicts, including problem gamblers, meth addicts, cocaine addicts, alcoholics, often experience a lot of impairments in their prefrontal cortex. So just as a recap, I'm not sure how to erase this pen. Here we go. Drawing. Okay. So real quick, just as a recap, when we are dealing with problem gamblers, we're dealing with people who have a limbic system that is crying out for a lot of stimulation. It says, we need it and we need it now. And they have a brake system that is diminished. So it's not that my stepfather didn't know what's right and wrong. It's not that he wasn't a good person and he didn't care about my family. It was that the voice that says, hey, you know you want it. Imagine what you could do if you win the jackpot is so much louder than the voice that says, wait a minute, let's think about it. Let's stop and think. What are the consequences if you lose? What happens if you lose everything? That voice becomes really, really soft or muted. And that's what we're dealing with in addiction. So let me go ahead and talk a little bit about how we might go about providing treatment to problem gamblers real quick for the last part. Again, if there are any questions so far, please go ahead and type it in the chat box. And I haven't seen any, so I'll go ahead and continue. So there's been some research to show that we could actually identify a few subtypes of problem gamblers, and it could help us design interventions specific to them. So a research was recently conducted, a large epidemiological research, to look at problem gamblers and see how can we distinguish some of the subgroups. And 3 subgroups that were clearly distinguishable were identified. The first subgroup they called behaviorally conditioned is the largest subgroup. These individuals, ironically also, because they generally have lower severity of problems, usually don't come for treatment as much. But if they do, they usually get better outcomes because they're not as severely addicted. Usually these people start gambling because by chance or for fun. They just started because it's a social thing. They gamble with their friends. And because of whatever reason, maybe because they started to develop a cognitive distortion that, oh, you know, I have a lot of skills, that if I just practice, I could be the best poker player. They start to get into trouble. So they start to develop a gambling problem. They may start to even meet DSM diagnostic criteria. It may be episodic, though. They may have periods where they gamble a lot, but they don't have any DSM diagnosis or symptoms that they meet. And then there may be periods where they gamble so much that they fall into problems and they actually meet 4, 5, or more of the DSM diagnostic criteria. Most of these individuals, one of the key things is that they don't have a premorbid disorder. They don't come with a substance abuse or depression or anxiety problems. That may occur because of their gambling problems, but it wasn't a reason that they start gambling in the first place. This group, again, more motivated for treatment because they're less severe anyways, and they're more likely to be symptom-free after receiving treatment. So again, predominantly males. How is that different from the second group? We have another group called the emotionally vulnerable group. They're overrepresented by women. We also see a lot of our ethnic minority immigrant populations, maybe more this group as well, maybe older gamblers as well. This group doesn't really gamble for not so much for the wins, not so much for the excitement or for the ego, like, oh, because I'm so great, I'm the best gambler or poker player in the world, but more to escape problems, to elevate their negative mood or affect, or to escape or dissociate. So because of that's the reason they want to gamble, they may prefer games like slot machines or computer-based gambling that is conducive for tunnel vision, for escape and dissociation. They also have more likely to come with premorbid mood anxiety disorders. They may start gambling because they wanted to elevate their negative affect. Maybe it's a way to self-medicate. Greater rates of depression, higher lethality because they're more likely, they have greater risk for suicide. Using gambling to cope, as I mentioned. Treatment may be different because we had to address some of the underlying vulnerabilities. Another smaller group, similar to the emotionally vulnerable in size, is what the researchers call the antisocial impulsive group. How is this group different? They often have a trait of impulsivity starting really, really young in life, maybe in their teenage years or even younger, maybe have co-occurring diagnosis of ADHD or conduct disorder while they were young, maybe even antisocial personality disorder. Because they had this impulsivity trait since they're young, they may also bring with them a lot more other problems, maybe problems with the legal justice system, social problems, relationship problems, greater harms. Again, because of their impulsivity, part of their gambling disorder may be this loss of control, very poor impulse regulation, especially key is that it started from early on. There may be more underlying biologically based issues, maybe some brain disorder, other brain disorders that may be present as well. Sometimes we've seen a correlation between traumatic brain injuries from people from childhood to addictions later on as well. So just a quick overview of the differences. Again, gender differences and socio-demographic. In the first group, we see primarily males. In emotionally vulnerables, more females, and maybe some of the other marginalized groups. With antisocial, we see males also, but tend to be also younger when they start. Motivations for gambling may be different. Types of games also are different depending on why it is that they want to gamble. Age of onset is different too, with emotionally vulnerable gamblers often starting gambling older at an older stage in life, with antisocial gamblers typically starting younger, and different premorbid disorders as well. How will we approach treatment differently? With behaviorally conditioned, you may be able to provide them with some basic interventions like cognitive restructuring, to provide them with some harm reduction and relapse prevention strategies, maybe even let them work on self-help manuals on their own, and they may be able to do pretty well with that. With the EV group, the emotionally vulnerable, you may also, in addition, need to, after you stabilize them, address the underlying mood vulnerabilities to help them develop more coping skills and ways to manage stress and to build non-judgmental support, and maybe even some pharmacological treatment to address some of the underlying depression, anxiety, and mood disorders. With the last group, in addition, you also want to control the impulse, dysregulation, and some of the other co-occurring antisocial, attentional, and other problems. Okay, I realize I'm moving a little fast at the end. Again, feel free to just chime in with questions when you feel the need. I'm going to do the last part now on how to apply what we learned today to our practice. So basically, as clinicians, when we work with people who are addicted, we're trying to do two basic things. We're trying to help individuals to calm their limbic system so that it's not screaming out saying, hey, I need this and I need this now, to help quiet the cravings a little bit. And at the same time, also to strengthen their prefrontal cortex so they're better able to apply the brakes so that even if cravings are present, they're better able to resist and to delay. How do we do that? Well, a lot of times with the GO system, how do we quiet the limbic system? We may need to think about pharmacological treatments for clients. How do we help them get some medication to reduce the intensity of some of the cravings and urges? How do we address some of the comorbid issues? Many of clients are dually or polydiagnosed, diagnosable, so we may need to address some of those simultaneous issues as well. With how do we strengthen the prefrontal cortex? A lot of what you already do are doing exactly that. Conventional psychotherapy, we know, can change the brain. 12-step programs. We also know that it's important to teach clients how to address issues like trauma and how to deal with stress management. We also know from a lot of new research coming out now that it's so important for clients in brain healing to address nutrition and wellness, because if the brain isn't getting enough brain food, it's not going to be able to recover as well. So because all of you are probably very familiar with the basic therapeutic treatments like 12-step psychotherapy, we're going to focus more on talking about the medications that are available talking about trauma, stress management, and also talking about nutrition and wellness for the last part. So we know that there are several FDA-approved medications to treat tobacco use, alcohol, and drug use, but there are currently no FDA-approved medications to treat pathological gambling. Okay. However, there have been many medications that have been studied that have been found to be effective for the treatment of gambling addiction. So we're going to talk about that. So although there are no FDA approved, there are some medications that you, in conjunction with a medical doctor or psychiatrist, can consider to help boost the client along the way in their recovery. Let's start by talking about the category of SSRIs, or serotonin system medications. SSRIs by far is the most researched and has a well-established safety record, even in treatment of pathological gamblers, well tolerated. When might you prescribe serotonin system medications? Maybe for clients who have pre- or comorbid depression, especially when their gambling disorder has a key characteristic of obsessive thoughts, racing thoughts, or repetitive compulsive thoughts about gambling. It's not surprising because SSRIs are also prescribed to treat OCD. So if client symptoms may be more along those lines of obsessive compulsive spectrum, you may find that SSRIs could be your first line of defense. Because of its safety records, SSRIs may be a good choice to start with any problem gambler. However, we also know from research that there are some problem gamblers who don't respond well to SSRIs. When research looked at these individuals more closely, they found that many of these problem gamblers who didn't respond well to SSRIs also has a comorbid disorder of mood cycling, mood disorders. So, individuals who may be gambling as part of a bipolar or manic depressive spectrum, individuals who gamble due to high impulsivity with very low planning, these individuals might benefit from mood stabilizers like lithium. Lithium can be prescribed as an adjunct to SSRIs or in place of it if SSRIs have not been found to have a positive impact. Finally, we also have some medications that work as antagonists for opiate receptors, such as naltrexone, which has been used to treat alcoholism, heroin addiction. We also have medications like bupropion, which goes by the brand name Wellbutrin, which works on the norepinephrine and dopamine systems. These medications have all been used for treating things like nicotine addiction, smoking cessation, alcoholism, and many other drug abuse and dependence, and have been found to be effective. Naltrexone and bupropion have been minimally studied on gambling, but so far has been found to be pretty promising as well. So for clients who have a very strong characteristic of urge or craving, those are some of the major features of their disease, or they have comorbid substance addiction. Some of these medications can be considered and can potentially be helpful. A lot of these gamblers find that on these medications, they can reduce the intensity of urges and cravings, and therefore better able to stay abstinent. Okay. Let's see, real quick. Let me move on. So let's talk about how does the cycle of addiction gets addressed in our current treatment models, and how is it not breaking this cycle of addiction, and what else could we do instead? This is basically the neurological model of addiction that we just talked about for this whole webinar. So clients, let's say a client of ours, let's talk about smoking as an example. A client of ours is a social smoker. So the client already has associated smoking with an ability to modulate their mood. And the client experiences some cues in life. It could be both positive and negative. Positive could be they just had a really good meal and now they really want to smoke. Or they had a negative experience. They got yelled at work by their boss. So these cues can translate to emotions, negative affect. They feel really stressed out, they feel uncomfortable, they feel distressed. And obviously that's not a feeling that we like to have for the long run. So then a craving is created. They say, I really just feel like having that cigarette. I could either make that negative feeling go away, or I can elevate that positive feeling even more. Because I'm feeling really good, I'm going to make it last longer or feel even better. So then if a client gives in and smoke, that creates an associative memory in our survival centers, right? It remembers. It says, oh, smoking makes us feel better. And in that way, it reinforces that cycle again, right? Over time, when we do it more and more, we don't even need to think about it anymore. It's not about someone thinking, today I'm not feeling really good, I'm going to have a smoke and feel better. It then becomes a reflex. We don't even need to think about it. It becomes an instinct. And, because it's become embedded in our limbic system. So that when we do it, when we continue to do it, that cycle gets strengthened. This is when we start to see people even unconsciously plan their whole day around opportunities to smoke, right? Like, oh, no, I can't have the meeting at 11 o'clock because that's when I smoke. So how does our treatment currently address this cycle? So a lot of our treatment currently address this cycle in a couple of ways. We might work with clients to avoid cues. We might work with them to say, well, how do we avoid triggers, right? Don't drive that route home when you pass by those places. Get your checks directly deposited into your bank accounts instead of getting it handed to you at work, because then you'll get triggered to go and cash out. And so we also substitute behaviors. What other things can you do instead when you get that craving? But a lot of times we see this may not actually break the cycle of addiction, right? We see people switch addictions oftentimes. It's because we actually haven't disrupted this cycle. People go from becoming an alcoholic to a gambling addict. They go from gambling addict to a workaholic because this cycle still continues. They haven't actually broken that cycle. We also know that cravings, right, actually continues to get stronger with time. It actually doesn't get better oftentimes. And craving is the largest, single biggest reason that people relapse and that people fall back into their behaviors again. Research shows that over time, when people abstain from drugs or alcohol or gambling, a lot of things do get better. In this study of smokers, they're actually paid to stop smoking. And they find that over time, at 35 days, after a month of not smoking, withdrawal symptoms get better, of course. They don't feel as jittery. They don't feel all the physical and mental withdrawal symptoms. Their background craving scores also get better, meaning when you're just sitting around, at this moment in time, how much do you feel like smoking? That gets better. However, interestingly, we find that the longer they don't smoke, the trigger-related cravings, the cue-induced cravings actually get stronger. So at 35 days, when they get exposed to images about smoking, triggers, right? The cravings to smoke is actually much stronger the longer they stay abstinent. We also see that even when they're in controlled environments like a residential program, when they're not exposed to cues at all, right? When they get out, their cue-related cravings actually may be at its height. So, a person may feel like, hey, I'm doing pretty good in a 30-day, 90-day residential program, but interestingly, when they come out and get exposed to cues, that's actually where they could be at the most highest risk for relapse. And clients cannot realistically avoid all cues, right? We could avoid as much cues as we can, but with gambling, it's also very difficult. Gambling is everywhere. And soon, in California, we could actually gamble on the internet. We have internet ads for gambling. We have mobile apps for gambling. And so it may be difficult to fully limit ourselves from triggers and cravings. So what does this implication have for our treatment? A lot of research is now proposing that a different approach like mindfulness can be helpful. And how is mindfulness different than anything else? Interestingly, we find that mindfulness that focuses on acceptance, on accepting things as they are, not controlling things that you can't control. Focusing on the present is not about the past that you can't change. It's not about the future that you still don't have control over. Paying attention to the physical symptoms so that we are not interpreting symptoms as something that's moral, that I'm weak, I'm a bad person, but rather just as physical sensations, non-judgmental. We realize that when we try to ask clients to repress or suppress cravings, it simply doesn't work. I think in a lot of conventional treatment models, we create this system where people feel a lot of shame and guilt related to cravings or relapse. We can see from this quote, a person who has been abstinent for 2 or 3 years, having just dreamt about drinking, actually feeling a lot of emotions around that. And you can see from the emotion that there's a lot of guilt and shame related to that. Because oftentimes in conventional treatment, we frame relapse as a failure, as a personal failure, as a treatment failure. And oftentimes that actually adds fuel to the fire, as we remember earlier. Negative affect, like shame and guilt, actually could lead people to more likely get cravings to use again, to gamble again. And so, how is mindfulness different? Interestingly, when they did a research with people who are overweight or obese, who are trying to learn how to cope with food cravings more, they had 2 groups. One group, everyone was taught just regular diet, instructions on exercise and nutrition. And then one group, the experimental group, was given in addition a 7-week course, manualized, focused on mindfulness practice, acceptance-based training. So they were taught how to just pay attention to the physical sensations of food cravings, how to sit through it, how to accept it as it is and not put a label on things. Acceptance basically is different because acceptance doesn't require the addict to control their cravings, right? And interestingly, when they found that the clients who were taught about acceptance, they paradoxically increased their control over triggers when they were exposed to food cues. They found that they had higher level of control over their cravings. When clients are taught not to have to control something, they actually, ironically, gain greater control over time. So how does mindfulness view cravings? Mindfulness training actually teaches clients to sit with or write out their cravings. So that, why do they do that? Why do you have to sit through cravings? Well, when we think about addiction basically is about reducing negative emotions and feelings. It's about avoiding pain, right? Using pleasure to dissociate to avoid pain. Clients through addiction, through that addictive loop that we talked about earlier, basically have learned that, hey, when I picked up that cigarette to smoke, when I gamble, I could make these negative emotions and feelings go away almost instantaneously. So they've never had to train themselves to sit through addiction, to sit through cravings, right? When clients actually sit through the physical sensations of craving, they learn that, hey, cravings are just physical feelings rather than moral imperatives that I have to act on. These are not things that, oh my God, if I don't smoke right now, I feel like I'm going to die. I feel like, my head's going to explode. They also gained first-hand experience that, even if I don't do anything about it, even if I don't act on these cravings actually go away with time. They're not permanent. Yes, they could come back over and over again, but they're simply physical sensations and they will go away. If we actually teach clients to be able to sit through cravings without acting on it, it could actually help them disrupt that addictive cycle or loop. Because when we give in, we're adding fuel to the fire. And every time that we don't, and we actually just sit through the sensations and learn how to pay attention to it, we're not adding fuel to that fire. So this is potentially a way for us to disrupt that addictive cycle. And we know that mindfulness requires training because it requires a different mindset, literally. a different mindset actually is engaged when we practice mindfulness than when we are in our normal everyday default mode. Our default network is sometimes called a narrative framework. It's narrative as in storytelling, like when our mind wanders, when we're creating stories, when we're thinking about ourselves in relationship to other people. This is the part of the brain that's activated. When we experience something sensory, we're not just sensing it for what they are, we're putting our own interpretation on it, right? When we experience craving, it isn't just a physical sensation. We're not just thinking, oh, my heart is racing, my forehead is sweaty. We're thinking, I'm such a terrible person, I'm such a weak person. Why am I feeling this? Why won't it just go away? I really wish that I could be a stronger person. So those are all filters that we put on our own experience. When we teach clients about mindfulness, they can learn to activate their experiential network, which is about moment to moment. It's not about thinking, dwelling on the past. It's not stressing and having anxieties about the future. It's about staying in the moment. It's using an older part of the brain that's important for processing sensory information. It's taking in that sensory information as they come in real time, so that they're paying attention to their bodies, they're paying attention to how that feels physically. They find that these two processes are actually inversely correlated, meaning that when you engage in one, the other one is automatically shut down. And so, for example, when you are when you're washing dishes, you're thinking about work, you're stressing about the meetings that are coming up, you may be more likely to cut yourself on a broken glass because you missed it. Because the sensory map, the visual map in our brain is less active when the narrative map is turned on. You don't see as much. You have tunnel vision. You only see, you miss things that are in your peripheral. So mindfulness training can actually allow people to have better grasp of, hey, which path am I on at a given time? And better able to switch from one to the other more effectively. People who don't have mindfulness training by default actually activate their narrative pathways when they are processing information, when they are going through treatment. And so it's really helpful for us to be able to train clients to be able to differentiate between the two. Why is it helpful? We know that mindfulness actually rewires the brain physically. We know that some parts of the brain actually increases in density and other parts decrease in density to help clients in their recovery. For example, the parts that are important for learning and memory actually gets strengthened. The gray matter density actually increases. And the parts of our brain, such as the amygdala, which is our fear center, which is our stress and emotional memory center, actually gets decreased. So clients are better able to manage their stress. Mindfulness is something that you don't need to replace your current other treatment modalities. You can complement your current interventions. And, it's also helpful for co-occurring comorbid problems like depression, anxiety, other kinds of addictions. It can also be helped with mindfulness. And that clients who are taught mindfulness in the 4-month follow-up report a lot fewer cravings and also improvements in awareness and acceptance. If we can help clients to better manage stress, and stress is a big trigger for clients, right? A lot of times our clients go back to gamble, go back to some of the other behaviors because of stress as a trigger. If we can help them deal with that, they are much better able to prevent relapse. So I'm going to wrap up that part and just talk a little bit more about nutrition now. In the last few minutes, I'm going to skip some of these issues. We know that nutrition is important because poor nutrition is correlated with addictions. We also know that addiction is highly correlated with a condition of hypoglycemia, where people have chronic low blood sugar. And that's not good because low blood sugar can actually increase cravings, not just for food or sugars, but also for their addictive behaviors because our brains go into withdrawal. Low blood sugar produces withdrawal-like symptoms such as shakes, jitters, tremors, irritation, so both physical and emotional issues. And so these withdrawal-like symptoms can lead people to relapse. A lot of addictions are highly correlated with hypoglycemia. Because of the nature of the addiction, people have poor diets often, they're not eating right, they're eating foods that are highly processed, and so a lot of times they end up with this chronic issue of hypoglycemia. For brain to properly heal, it's important that we keep clients' blood sugar levels elevated. How do we do that? We do that, I'm going to skip some of these. We do that by helping clients with giving them tips for basic nutritional maintenance, keeping blood sugar steady by eating complex carbs like whole grains that take longer to break down. Anything that breaks down faster in our bodies and absorbed into our bloodstreams faster will also crash faster. And so making sure that people have diet rich in fibers and proteins or good fats, healthy fats, like olive oils and flax oils or fish oils that are high in omega-3 can be helpful because those elements take longer for the body to break down, and so it keeps the blood sugar steady longer. Avoid refined sugars, white flour, and for a lot of people, they may want to they may think about, oh, it's healthier to take less carbs, but actually either extremes are not healthy. For brain to properly heal, carb intake that's too low can be very harmful for the brain, and too high is also not good. If clients want to cut out carbs, it's good to cut out empty carbs that don't provide other nutrients like sodas and, again, refined sugars and things like that. But taking more healthier carbs through taking more vegetables and fruits. Exercising is important too. Exercise training actually naturally increases serotonin levels and in turn improves sleep, reduces depression and stress, and all those things actually help overall with the brain healing. So I'm going to end there, just talk about some future directions and resources that are available. Some of the technologies are developing by leaps and bounds, shows that soon we might be able to have using functional magnetic imaging technologies to provide real-time neurofeedback for clients to be able to see visually how their brain has changed and how they can learn different practices to strengthen their prefrontal cortex and to quiet their limbic systems. A lot of new advances in molecular genetics may soon be able to help us zero in on gene variants or variations that might predispose someone to addictions. And so that could mean we could have better knowledge about what medications to prescribe to people so that we don't have all this trial and error. So those are all kind of in the works. I also have included some resources here for you. That could be links to some of the experiments we've talked about, some videos that you could learn more about neurons. HBO documentary on addiction had a whole series, including a whole chapter on brain imaging, and also some of the other online modules and resources. If you work with clients who are battling substance addictions, I also highly recommend this particular resource developed by the University of Utah called a Mouse Party. It's actually a really fun, interactive, and easy to understand tool that you can use with clients to help them understand what's actually happening inside the brains when you take different kinds of drugs, how the different drugs are hijacking the brain. Lastly, again, I want to remind you to please complete your evals and post-tests. If you have any questions now, I know there's only one person now still remaining on the webinar, but again, if you have any questions, feel free to pose them now. Otherwise, again, I thank you for participating in our weekend webinars. I know it's difficult. We're going to have this recorded and available, so if others want to refresh or join after the fact and participate in the webinar, they're more than welcome to do so. Okay, great. If there are no questions, feel free to log off the webinar and complete your evaluations and post-tests, and I'll be in touch. If you need anything, my email is listed. Feel free to get in touch with me.